They saw the fray on his collar and judged him a pauper. They heard his silence and assumed him a fool. But as the brash tech mogul demanded the old man be thrown from Boston's most exclusive restaurant, he had no idea he was sneering at the man who had carved the very mahogany paneling he leaned against. Everyone in the room saw a derelict, an inconvenient spectre at their feast of opulence. They saw him until the waitress, a ghost in a black apron, stepped from the shadows and made a gesture with her hands that spoke a language of wood, steel, and time, a language only two souls in that room could possibly understand. That silent conversation didn't just quiet the room. It brought a digital empire to its knees and resurrected a legacy everyone thought was long buried. What happens when the person you dismiss as dust is the bedrock on which your entire world is built? You are about to find out. The Gilded Quill was not merely a restaurant. It was a museum piece where Boston's Brahmin elite and new money titans waged quiet wars of succession and status. Tucked away on a cobblestone street in Beacon Hill, it was a sanctuary of old-world charm, smelling of beeswax, old leather, and the subtle intoxicating aroma of generational wealth. The gas lamps cast a warm, flickering glow on walls paneled with Honduran mahogany, and every table was an original creation by a forgotten 18th-century master. For Clara Mayhew, it was a beautifully furnished prison. At 26, Clara moved with a grace that belied the exhaustion etched deep in the corners of her soft grey eyes. She had once been the youngest associate curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, a prodigy with an almost supernatural ability to identify the provenance of a piece of furniture by the subtlest curl of a wood shaving or the unique tooling marks of a dovetail joint. Her specialty was pre-colonial American cabinet makers, a field of passionate, dusty obscurity. But academic brilliance couldn't pay for the experimental gene therapy her younger sister, Lily, desperately needed. A rare degenerative disease was slowly stealing Lily's world, and the hospital bills were a relentless tide, threatening to pull them both under. So the curator traded her tweed jackets for a starched apron, her scholarly articles for a crumb scraper. Her encyclopedic knowledge of mortise and tenon joints was now used to ensure the tables she once would have lectured on were wiped clean for men who saw them as nothing more than a place to rest their $1,000 cocktails. Clara, Table 7 wants another bottle of the Screaming Eagle. And try to look like you're not attending a funeral, hissed Mr. Abernathy, the manager. Abernathy was a man perpetually contorted by anxiety. He wore his tuxedo like a suit of armor, but his darting eyes and the sheen of sweat on his upper lip betrayed the terror within. He was a servant to the powerful, and his primary fear was the man holding court at the restaurant's center table, a throne of plush red velvet, Bryce Calloway. At 32, Bryce was the CEO of Nexus, a tech startup that had devoured the market with an app no one over 40 understood. He was handsome in the sleek, sterile way of a luxury car advertisement, dressed in a minimalist black suit that probably cost more than Clara's entire student debt. He was loud, arrogant, and drunk on the modern god of disruption. His disciples, a collection of young men in identical suits, hung on his every word, their laughter a synchronized chorus of adulation. "So I tell the city council," Bryce boomed, his voice slicing through the delicate clinking of silver on porcelain. "Historic preservation is a boat anchor. You want a smart city? You have to bulldoze the past." And you know what the chairman said? He asked where he should send the wrecking ball. The table erupted in sycophantic laughter. Clara approached with a water pitcher, moving silently, trying to remain part of the scenery. Bryce didn't glance at her. To him, she was an automaton. He gestured expansively, his hand nearly striking the pitcher from her grasp. "Watch it, sweetheart," Bryce sneered, his gaze fixed on his acolytes. "This watch is worth more than your college degree. Oh wait, you probably don't have one." Clara bit the inside of her cheek, the coppery taste of blood, a familiar anchor in a sea of humiliation. "My apologies, Mr. Calloway," she murmured, her voice a ghost, as she retreated back into the comforting shadows of the service station. It was precisely 9:15 p.m. when the carefully curated atmosphere of the Gilded Quill fractured. The heavy oak doors, usually opened by a doorman for guests with reservations made seasons in advance, swung inward with a slow, deliberate creak. The room didn't fall silent out of respect, but out of a collective, jarring confusion. An old man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He looked as if he had wandered in from a forgotten century. He wore a heavy tweed overcoat, the kind of garment built to withstand decades of harsh New England winters. The elbows were worn smooth, and a button was missing from the cuff, but the weave, Clara noted with an instinct she couldn't suppress, was a tight, complex Donegal tweed. He leaned on a simple cane of dark, unvarnished cherry wood, its handle worn to a satiny patina by the grip of a single hand over countless years. His face was a road map of wrinkles, a testament to a long and arduous journey. But his eyes were a startling, pale blue, sharp and clear as a winter sky. They held no plea, no apology. They simply observed. He moved with a pronounced limp, each step a carefully managed negotiation with pain. Mr. Abernathy looked as if he'd just seen a rat scurry across his polished floor. He moved with a speed born of pure panic, intercepting the old man before he could take more than 3 steps into the dining room. "Sir! Excuse me, sir!" Abernathy whispered, his voice a frantic hiss. He physically blocked the man's path. "I believe you've made a mistake. The kitchens are in the back if you're looking for a meal. We don't offer charity here." The old man's gaze didn't flicker. He didn't even seem to register Abernathy's presence. His pale blue eyes swept across the room, past the gawking patrons, and settled on a small empty table in a quiet alcove by the fireplace. Table 12. It was, by all accounts, the worst table in the house, tucked away and often used by staff for a quick break. But it was the only one made of solid, unadorned tiger maple. The old man attempted to step around the flustered manager. "Now you listen to me," Abernathy said, his voice rising in pitch, attracting the attention he so desperately wanted to avoid. "You are not welcome here. This is a private establishment for our patrons. You are disturbing our guests." At the center table, Bryce Calloway turned, a cruel, predatory smile spreading across his face. He thrived on conflict, especially when it affirmed his place at the top of the food chain. "Let him be, Abernathy," Bryce called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "Maybe he's here to critique the decor. He certainly looks like he was alive when they built it." Bryce's table howled with laughter. Abernathy's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. Humiliated by his most important customer, he transferred his rage to the silent intruder. "Security," Abernathy snapped into the tiny microphone on his lapel. "I have a vagrant creating a disturbance in the main dining hall. Remove him. Now." The old man finally stopped. He looked at Abernathy, then his gaze drifted to Bryce. He opened his mouth, a faint, guttural sound emerging, a frustrated exhalation of air. His jaw worked, his throat constricted, but no words came. He lifted a hand, the fingers gnarled but clean, and tapped his temple, then shook his head in a gesture of profound frustration. "Oh, brilliant," Bryce announced to the room. "He's broken. A homeless mute. What is this? A Dickens novel? Get him out of here, Abernathy, before he starts stinking up the place. I'm trying to enjoy a $500 piece of fish." 2 burly security guards in ill-fitting suits emerged from a back hallway. They were not men paid for their subtlety. They moved towards the old man, their hands reaching for his arms. Clara watched from her station, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But she saw things others missed. She saw the way the old man held his cane. Not as a crutch, but with the balanced, familiar grip of a craftsman holding a tool. She saw the tweed of his coat. It was old, yes, but it was impeccably clean, and the stitching on the patched elbow was tiny and perfect, a work of art in itself. And she saw his hands. They weren't the hands of a beggar. They were the calloused, powerful hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands, shaping hard materials into things of beauty. Without a conscious thought, Clara set her water pitcher down on the service counter with a sharp clang that made several heads turn. "Stop!" Her voice, though not loud, cut through the tension with surprising authority. Abernathy spun around, his eyes bulging with disbelief. "Clara, get back to your station. This doesn't concern you." "He has a reservation," Clara lied, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her voice trembled, but she planted her feet, a small, unmovable object in the path of the advancing guards. She walked past them and stood, not quite between them and the old man, but beside him, a quiet gesture of solidarity. "What are you talking about?" Abernathy hissed, his face inches from hers. "He's a street person." "Table 12, Clara said, the lie gaining momentum as she spoke. "The reservation was under Thorn. I took the call myself this afternoon. He requested the maple table specifically. There was no such reservation, but Abernathy, a man whose greatest terror was a clerical error that might displease a wealthy patron, faltered. His mind raced, trying to place the name. Thorn. It sounded vaguely familiar, like old money. I saw no such reservation on the books," Abernathy stammered, his blustering confidence deflating. "It was a late edition," Clara pressed, channeling the quiet authority she used to use when debating acquisitions with the museum's board. "A personal request to the owner's office. It must not have trickled down to your system yet." She turned to the old man, offering a small, respectful smile. She gestured towards table 12. "Mr. Thorn, your table is ready." The old man looked at her. For a fleeting moment, the icy clarity of his eyes warmed with something that looked like startled comprehension. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, and, with a dignity that made a mockery of his worn clothes, walked past the stunned guards and the sputtering manager, seating himself at the humble maple table. The room was utterly silent. Bryce Calloway looked apoplectic. His evening's entertainment had been hijacked by a waitress. "You have got to be kidding me," Bryce spat, rising from his chair. "Abernathy, are you actually going to let this serving girl dictate who sits in your restaurant? That man probably has lice. If he stays, I go. And when I go, the Nexus corporate account, with its 6-figure annual spend, goes with me." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and toxic. That corporate account paid for half the restaurant's operating costs. It paid for Abernathy's salary. It paid for Clara's meager paycheck, which in turn paid for the medicine that was keeping her sister alive. The silence in the gilded quill was now suffocating. Every eye was on the unfolding drama. Abernathy's gaze flickered between Bryce's furious face, Clara's defiant stance, and the silent old man who sat at table 12 with a straight, unwavering posture. The calculation in Abernathy's mind was brutal and swift. Bryce was profit. The old man was a problem. Clara was disposable. "Clara," Abernathy said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper, "you have made a catastrophic error in judgment. Escort the man out now, or you are fired." Clara looked at the old man. He had placed his hands on the smooth surface of the maple table. They were trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from what she now recognized as the fine tremors of age, or perhaps Parkinson's. He looked solitary, a man marooned on an island of silence. He looked, she realized with a pang in her chest, like her own grandfather in his final years, a man full of stories with no one left to listen. "I can't do that, Mr. Abernathy," Clara said, her voice barely audible but firm. "Then you're fired!" Abernathy barked, his voice cracking with a mix of fury and relief. "Security, remove this man and escort Miss Mayhew off the premises. Her employment is terminated." "Wait," Bryce Calloway interjected, a sly grin returning to his face. He strolled over to table 12, a glass of expensive whiskey swirling in his hand. He'd loomed over the seated old man. "I want to have a little fun first." Bryce slammed his free hand down on the table, making the simple water glass jump. The old man didn't flinch. "Hey, old-timer," Bryce sneered, his voice loud and mocking. "Can you hear me? Or are the ears as broken as the voice box?" The old man slowly lifted his gaze to meet Bryce's. His expression was unreadable, a mask of weathered stone. "I bet he doesn't have a penny to his name," Bryce laughed, glancing back at his table for approval. "Here." He reached into the pocket of his ridiculously expensive suit and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill. He crumpled it into a tight ball and threw it at the old man. It struck him in the chest and fell into his lap. "Take it," Bryce said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Go get yourself a hot meal. Somewhere else. Get out of my sight." The old man looked down at the crumpled bill. With deliberate, almost painfully slow movements, he picked it up. He carefully smoothed it out on the table. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his tweed coat. Everyone watched, a palpable tension gripping the room. Was he reaching for a weapon? He pulled out a small, flat object. It was a carpenter's pencil, the kind with thick, rectangular lead, its sides worn smooth with use. He turned the $100 bill over. On the clean white back, he wrote a single, shaky word, then pushed the bill back towards Bryce. Bryce snatched it up. He squinted at the writing. "Insufficient," he read aloud, then threw his head back and roared with laughter. "The beggar thinks he's a critic. He says $100 is insufficient." Bryce turned his cruel gaze on Clara. "You want to be his champion, sweetheart? Fine. Since you're so sure he's a paying customer, you take his order. But here's the deal. When he can't pay the bill at the end of the night, and we both know he can't, I'm not just having him arrested for theft. I'm having you arrested as an accomplice. Deal?" Abernathy, seeing a way to appease Bryce, nodded eagerly. "That's perfectly reasonable. A very fair arrangement, Mr. Calloway." Clara knew it was a cage. The cheapest appetizer on the menu was $30. But she had come too far to retreat now. She looked at the old man, at his quiet dignity, and nodded. "Deal." She walked to the table, her professionalism a thin shield against her fear. "Sir," she said softly, "what can I get for you?" The old man looked up at her. He tapped the menu with a gnarled finger but didn't open it. He then lifted his hands, a gesture of helplessness. He wanted to communicate, but the path from his mind to his mouth was broken. The frustration in his eyes was a palpable thing. He reached for a napkin and the carpenter's pencil. He drew something. It wasn't a word, but a shape. It was a small, elegant drawing of a joint where two pieces of wood meet. A dovetail joint, perfectly rendered. Bryce leaned over her shoulder, reeking of whiskey and arrogance. "What the hell is that? Is he drawing his birdhouse? The man is senile." But Clara's mind wasn't on Bryce. It was racing, connecting disparate points of knowledge from a life she thought she'd left behind. A dovetail joint, the symbol of the highest level of craftsmanship. But it was more than that. She remembered a footnote in a dusty monograph about the legendary anonymous colonial cabinet maker known only as the Artisan of Beacon Hill. He didn't sign his work with a name, but with a single, perfectly cut blind dovetail joint hidden on the underside of every piece. Legend had it that his favorite meal, served in the taverns where he worked, was a simple dish of slow-roasted lamb shank with root vegetables. The local craftsman, in his honor, had nicknamed the dish the Dovetail. It was an obscure piece of historical trivia, meaningless to anyone else in the world. But to a specialist curator, it was a secret language. The old man looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. Was it possible? Could this young woman understand? Clara took a slow, steadying breath. She ignored Bryce's mocking presence. She looked the old man directly in the eye. She didn't speak. Instead, she lifted her own hands. She mimicked the gesture of planing a piece of wood smooth, then held up 5 fingers, and then made a motion like a saw cutting. 5-hour braise? The reaction was immediate and profound. The old man's stone mask shattered. His eyes widened, and a sharp, ragged gasp of air escaped his lips. He stared at her as if she had just performed a miracle. He reached across the table and gripped her hand, his touch surprisingly strong, his calloused palm a testament to a life of labor. He nodded vigorously, once, twice, 3 times. Tears welled in his eyes, tracing clean paths through the weathered lines on his face. He let go of her hand and, with a trembling finger, pointed to the wine list, to the most expensive bottle, a 1982 Chateau Margaux. Clara straightened up, a strange, exhilarating confidence surging through her veins. She turned to face Abernathy and a dumbfounded Bryce Calloway. The room was silent, utterly baffled by the silent conversation they had just witnessed. "He will have the dovetail lamb shank," Clara announced, her voice clear and resonant, "and a bottle of the 1982 Margaux." Bryce's jaw hung open. "The dovetail? That's not on the menu. And that wine, that's a $12,000 bottle of wine." "It's an older item, from the original house menu," Clara said coolly, the lie coming easily now. "And he has excellent taste. As for the price, Mr. Calloway, that was the point of your little deal, wasn't it? To see if he could pay." Bryce's face turned a shade of purple that clashed horribly with his designer suit. "You little—" "I'm just taking his order," Clara said, cutting him off. "As per our agreement." She turned and walked towards the kitchen, leaving Bryce sputtering in her wake. But as she pushed through the swinging doors, her composure evaporated. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She had just ordered a meal that cost more than a down payment on a house. She glanced at her phone. Her bank account held a pathetic $80,000. For who to lasortistas? She prayed that the old tweed coat hanging on the back of the chair in the dining room had a Swiss bank account sewn into its lining. Because if it didn't, she wasn't just going to lose her job. She was going to prison, and Lily's last hope would be extinguished. Back in the dining room, Bryce Calloway had recovered his voice. He pulled out his sleek, impossibly thin smartphone. "Get me the police commissioner's private line," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Tell him I want 2 officers at the Gilded Quill in 45 minutes. We're about to witness a grand larceny, and I want a front-row seat for the arrest." The old man, Mr. Thorne, watched Bryce make the call. He didn't seem afraid. He took a sip of water. Then he reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out the small, flat carpenter's pencil. He laid it on the table beside his fork. He looked at Bryce, then at the pencil, and for the first time that night, a faint, enigmatic smile touched the old man's lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a master craftsman who knows the nail is about to be hit, perfectly and finally, on the head. The kitchen of the Gilded Quill was a hellscape of fire, steam, and shouted French curses. But Clara moved through the chaos with a newfound sense of purpose. She handed the order ticket for the lamb and the Margot to the head chef, a notoriously temperamental artist named Antoine. "Table 12, Antoine grunted, barely glancing at the ticket. He then did a double take, his eyes widening at the wine order. "The 82 Margot. Are you insane, Clara? Abernathy will skin you alive. Who is this for?" "A man with a very old soul," Clara replied, her voice steady. "Please, Antoine, make the lamb perfect, as if you were cooking it 100 years ago." Antoine looked at her, at the strange fire in her eyes, and for once he didn't argue. He simply nodded. "It will be a dish worthy of a king or a ghost." Out in the dining room the spectacle continued. Bryce Calloway, having finished his phone call, was now narrating the old man's every move to his rapt audience. "Look at him," Bryce said, gesturing with his fork. "He's probably never seen a real linen napkin before. He's probably wondering if he can eat it. This is what happens when standards slip. Society decays when we pretend everyone is equal. Some people are creators," he tapped his own chest, "and some are just debris." Mr. Thorne, however, seemed oblivious. He had picked up the simple, worn carpenter's pencil from the table. He held it not like a writing instrument, but like a scepter, his thumb gently rubbing the smooth, hexagonal sides. His gaze was fixed on the intricate grain of the tiger maple table, his eyes tracing patterns only he could see. When Clara returned with the wine, the ceremony silenced the room. The bottle was covered in a fine layer of dust, a relic from the deepest part of the cellar. She presented the bottle to Mr. Thorne. He simply nodded. With the precision of a surgeon, she uncorked it, the faint pop echoing in the hushed room. She poured a small amount into a glass. Mr. Thorne lifted the glass. He didn't swirl it like the new money connoisseurs. He simply held it to the light, observing the deep garnet color. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He closed his eyes. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. He was not tasting wine. He was tasting a memory. He looked up at Clara, his blue eyes communicating a universe of gratitude. His lips moved, forming a silent question. Clara leaned in, instinctively shielding the moment from Bryce's prying eyes. "Why?" his expression asked. "Why are you doing this?" Clara didn't use her hands this time. She spoke in a whisper so soft it was barely more than breath. "My grandfather was a carpenter," she lied, though it felt more true than anything she had said all night. "He had hands like yours. He taught me that you can judge a man's character by the way he cares for his tools." The old man's expression softened completely. The profound loneliness in his eyes receded, replaced by a flicker of fierce, protective warmth. He reached out and briefly touched the back of her hand, a gesture of profound thanks. "Enough with the secret meeting," Bryce shouted, his patience finally snapping. "What are you whispering about? Planning your getaway? Abernathy, I pay you to manage this place, not to let the help conspire with the vagrants." Abernathy scurried over, his face a mask of panic. "Miss Mayhew, that is enough. Serve the wine and return to your station. Do not interact with the gentlemen further." "I was just explaining the terroir of the Bordeaux region, sir," Clara said smoothly, her composure a fortress. "He was curious about the soil composition of the 1982 growing season." "He doesn't know what a zip code is, let alone a terroir," Bryce spat. Enraged by the old man's refusal to be intimidated, Bryce picked up a hard bread roll from his table's basket. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it across the room. The roll bounced off Mr. Thorne's shoulder and landed on the floor with a dull thud. A collective gasp went through the room. Even Bryce's own lackeys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This had crossed a line from cruel sport to outright assault. The old man didn't react. He didn't look at the roll. He didn't look at Bryce. He simply took another sip of his wine, his gaze distant, as if Bryce Calloway was nothing more than a buzzing fly, a minor annoyance in a world of much larger concerns. This utter lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Bryce more than any outburst could have. "You arrogant old fool!" Bryce stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I am Bryce Calloway. My company is valued at $10 billion. You will look at me when I throw food at you." "Mr. Calloway, please, sit down," Abernathy pleaded, wringing his hands. Just then, the kitchen doors swung open. Antoine himself, in his tall white toque, carried out the plate. It was a masterpiece. The lamb shank, glistening and dark, fell off the bone, surrounded by a medley of perfectly roasted root vegetables. The aroma of rosemary and slow-cooked meat filled the air, a scent of hearth and home that was a stark contrast to the cold tension in the room. Clara took the plate and set it gently before Mr. Thorne. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she whispered. The old man picked up his knife and fork. The tremors in his hands, so noticeable before, had vanished. He moved with an economy and grace that spoke of deep, ingrained breeding. He cut a piece of lamb, brought it to his lips, and chewed slowly. And then he began to weep. Not with loud, gut-wrenching sobs, but with a silent, steady stream of tears that flowed freely down his face. He continued to eat, bite after bite, the tears never ceasing. He was a man communing with a ghost, and the taste of this simple meal was the medium. "Oh, this is priceless," Bryce crowed, pulling out his phone and starting to record. "He's crying. It's probably the first decent food he's had in 50 years. Hey, Grandpa, say hi to the internet. We'll call this the Crying Hobo. It's gonna be viral." A white-hot rage, pure and potent, surged through Clara. She gripped a nearby chair so hard her knuckles were white. She wanted to shatter a bottle over Bryce's smug, handsome face. But she looked at the old man. He wasn't crying from gratitude for a meal. He was crying from the pain of remembrance. This dish, this restaurant, this very table, it meant something to him. It was a piece of a life he had lost. The old man finished his meal. He laid his knife and fork neatly across the plate. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, folding it precisely and placing it on the table. He looked at Clara and gave a single, resolute nod. It was time. "Check, please," Bryce called out, his voice giddy with anticipation. "And someone tell the Boston PD their guest of honor is about to make his grand exit." Abernathy practically ran to the point-of-sale system. He printed the bill, his hands shaking. He looked at Bryce, who gave him a subtle nod. Abernathy's fingers flew across the screen, adding charges. "Did you remember the service adjustments we discussed?" Bryce asked loudly. Abernathy swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, Mr. Calloway. A security surcharge for the disturbance, a sommelier consultation fee, and a table exclusivity premium." "Excellent," Bryce grinned. "Let's see the deadbeat pay for his own eviction." Clara took the leather billfold from Abernathy. She opened it before presenting it, as was protocol. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the blood drain from her face. The total was $28,250. This can't be right," she stammered, looking at Abernathy. "The wine is $12,000. The lamb is $65. "We charged him for Mr. Calloway's entire table as well," Abernathy said, avoiding her eyes. Mr. Calloway felt the gentleman should compensate the other patrons for the disruption to their evening. It's a private property damage fee." "That's not damage, that's extortion, Clara hissed. Call it whatever you want, Bryce said, strolling over. I call it an expensive lesson. The bill is the bill. If he can't pay, it's a felony. Now present it, waitress. Or would you rather I add conspiracy to your charge sheet? Her legs feeling like lead weights, Clara walked to table 12. She placed the billfold on the table. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. They've trapped you. The old man looked at her, his expression calm, almost reassuring. He opened the folder. He looked at the astronomical number. He did not flinch. He did not gasp. He simply reached once again into the deep inner pocket of his tweed coat. Bryce and his friends leaned forward, their faces alight with cruel anticipation. Here we go, Bryce narrated. What's it going to be? A bus token? A half-eaten sandwich? A fistful of lint? The old man's hand emerged. It was empty. He patted his other pockets, a slow, methodical search. All empty. He looked up at Clara, then at Bryce, and gave a small, sad shrug. He's broke! Bryce roared, clapping his hands together. I knew it! Abernathy, call the cops in! The show's about to begin. The two uniformed Boston police officers, who had been waiting discreetly in the foyer, pushed through the oak doors. They were young, serious, and clearly unimpressed with being called to a restaurant for a dine and dash. What's the problem here? The taller officer asked, his hand resting on his service weapon. Grand larceny, Bryce announced, pointing a triumphant finger at the old man. This man ordered a meal worth nearly $30,000 with no intention of paying. I want him arrested. The officer looked at the old man, then at the bill Clara was still holding. Sir, is this correct? Can you pay this bill? The old man remained silent. He's a mute, officer, Abernathy supplied helpfully, and a vagrant. He's been harassing our clientele all evening. Sir, the officer said, taking a step closer, I'm going to need you to stand up. You're coming with us to the station. Wait! Clara stepped between the officer and the table. Please, the bill is fraudulent. They added this man's entire tab to it. It's a setup. Ma'am, step aside, the officer warned, his voice firm. This is a civil matter that's now a criminal one. Don't make it worse for yourself by obstructing. The old man slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He was surprisingly tall, his stoop less pronounced when he stood. He looked the officer directly in the eye. He reached into his pocket one last time. Careful, he could have a shiv, Bryce yelped, theatrically ducking behind one of his friends. The old man's hand came out. He was holding the object Clara had seen him admiring earlier, the worn, flat carpenter's pencil. He held it out to the officer. The officer stared at it, bewildered. Sir, what is this? That's not going to cover the bill, Bryce howled with laughter. He's trying to pay with a pencil. Oh, this is too good. Maybe he'll offer to draw you a picture of the money. The old man withdrew his hand. He looked not at the police, not at Bryce, but at Clara. He held the pencil out to her. His eyes were not pleading now. They were commanding. It was a clear, silent instruction. Take it. Clara hesitated for only a second. Then she took the pencil from his steady hand. What, you want her to sign a confession for you? Bryce mocked. The old man's gaze shifted from Clara to a point across the room. He was looking at the restaurant's most famous feature, a magnificent, 9-foot-tall grandfather clock, an original by the legendary John Goddard of Newport. It was considered the crown jewel of the establishment. His eyes returned to Clara. He looked at the pencil in her hand, then back at the clock. The instruction was clear. I'm done with this circus, the officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Sir, put your hands behind your back. No, wait, Clara shouted, a wild, impossible idea blooming in her mind. An obscure fact from her research surfaced. A rumor. A myth about the secret signature of the artisan of Beacon Hill. Ignoring Abernathy's screech of her name, she ran. She ran not to the kitchen, not to the exit, but straight towards the priceless antique clock. "Clara, get away from there! That's a museum piece," Abernathy screamed. She reached the clock. She remembered the footnote in the book. The artisan, it is rumored, forsook a traditional signature, instead hiding his maker's mark behind a false panel on his larger works, accessible only by a tool of the trade. Her eyes scanned the intricate carvings on the clock's base. She saw it, a tiny, almost invisible seam in the wood, disguised as part of the decorative scrollwork. It was a keyhole, but not for a metal key. It was rectangular, the exact shape of the lead in a carpenter's pencil. With trembling hands, she inserted the tip of the old pencil into the slot. It was a perfect fit. She turned it. There was a soft, satisfying click. A small, hidden panel, no bigger than her hand, sprang open. The entire restaurant was silent, watching her. Bryce had stopped laughing. The officers had paused, their handcuffs dangling. Clara reached inside the compartment. Her fingers brushed against not a document, but a small brass plaque, cool to the touch. She pulled it out. It was tarnished with age, but the engraving was deep and clear. It read, "The Gilded Quill. Furnishings and Interior. Crafted and completed Anno Domini 1968. Silas Thorne, proprietor and carpenter." Clara's knees felt weak. She turned, holding the plaque aloft. "His name," she said, her voice ringing through the silent room, "is Silas Thorne. He didn't just come here for dinner. He built this restaurant. He carved the walls. He built the tables. He built that clock. He doesn't need to pay the bill." She looked directly at Abernathy, then at Bryce. "He owns it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, dense, a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Bryce Calloway's smug grin had frozen, then melted from his face, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Abernathy looked as though he might faint. The two police officers exchanged a bewildered glance, slowly lowering the handcuffs. That's impossible," Bryce stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. "The Thorne estate was dissolved decades ago. The old man died in a hiking accident in the Alps. It was all over the news." As if on cue, the grand oak doors of the restaurant swung open again. This time it wasn't a lone old man. It was a woman in a sharply tailored grey suit, her expression one of grim efficiency, followed by two imposing men who were clearly not restaurant security. The woman's eyes scanned the room, bypassing the chaos, and landed immediately on Silas Thorne. A wave of profound relief washed over her face. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Thank God. When you missed your 4 o'clock check-in, we initiated the security protocol. I see you've had a eventful evening." She walked directly to him, completely ignoring the governor's son and the police. She gently took his arm. "Are you all right, Silas?" Silas looked at her, then gave a slight nod. He then pointed a gnarled finger, not at Bryce, but at the fraudulent bill still sitting on the table. The woman, clearly his lawyer or chief of staff, picked it up. She read the total, her eyebrows rising in disdain. $28,150, she said coolly. She then looked at Abernathy, who seemed to be shrinking into his tuxedo. "Manager, my name is Eleanor Vance. I am Mr. Thorne's legal counsel. Would you care to explain this creative piece of accounting?" Abernathy opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. "I can explain," Bryce Calloway blustered, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. This man was causing a disturbance. He was a vagrant. I was merely holding him accountable. Eleanor Vance turned her gaze on him, and it was like being pinned by a laser. "You are Bryce Calloway of Nexus, are you not? The son of Gerald Calloway?" "That's right," Bryce said, puffing out his chest, relieved to be recognized. "My father knows everyone in this city." "Indeed he does," Eleanor said, with a thin, predatory smile. "He knows Silas Thorne very well. In fact, Mr. Thorne was the seed investor who gave your father the $50,000 loan to start his first real estate company back in 1985. A loan, I might add, that was given with a handshake and a promise because Mr. Thorne believed in investing in people, not just assets." She let that information hang in the air, a poisonous cloud. Bryce's face went from pale to ashen. The foundation of his entire life, the self-made myth he'd built around himself and his father, had just been demolished. "He invested in your father," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "And he holds a majority, non-voting share in the Calloway Holdings Trust that funds your little tech adventures. Or, I should say." He held. She pulled a tablet from her briefcase and tapped the screen a few times. "As per the moral turpitude clause in the original investment agreement, a clause Mr. Thorne insisted on in all his contracts, he has just exercised his right to liquidate his position, effective immediately. The sell order for 200 million shares of Nexus was just executed on the Hong Kong exchange 5 minutes ago." A phone on Bryce's table began to buzz frantically. Then another. And another. A symphony of panic. One of his junior associates answered his face turning white. "Bryce, the stock. It's down 70%. The board is calling an emergency meeting. They're invoking the conduct clause in your contract." Bryce stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror. He wasn't just losing face. He was being financially executed right here in the dining room. His digital empire, built on arrogance and vapor, was dissolving in real time. You can't do that," he whispered, looking at the silent old man. Silas Thorne met his gaze. He picked up the carpenter's pencil from the table where Clara had placed it. He found a clean napkin. He wrote 2 words, his handwriting shaky but clear. He pushed the napkin towards Bryce. Clara, standing nearby, could read it. It said, "Character is capital." The message was a death sentence. Bryce looked at the words, and something inside him finally broke. The arrogance, the bluster, it all evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out child. "Officers," Eleanor Vance said, turning to the still-stunned policeman. "This man," she gestured to Bryce, "assaulted my client by throwing an object at him. And this man," she pointed to Abernathy, "attempted to commit felony fraud. I would like to press charges against both of them." The officers, finally understanding the true power dynamic in the room, moved with renewed purpose. As they handcuffed a sobbing Bryce Calloway, he looked at Clara, his eyes pleading. "Please, tell him I'm sorry." Clara looked at Silas. The old man simply shook his head, a gesture not of vengeance, but of profound disappointment. Some debts could not be repaid with apologies. With the villains removed, an unnerving quiet descended. The remaining diners sat in stunned silence. Silas Thorne sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of solitude. His apraxia, Eleanor quietly explained to Clara, was the result of a severe stroke he'd suffered shortly after the faked report of his death, a ruse he'd orchestrated to escape a world he no longer recognized. He had spent the last 3 decades living quietly in a remote workshop in Vermont, communicating only with a handful of trusted staff, his hand still able to create the beauty his voice no longer could. Finally, Silas turned his full attention to Clara. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. What would become of the waitress who had started it all? He gestured for the pen and napkin again. Eleanor provided a fine fountain pen and a crisp sheet of paper from her briefcase. He wrote for a long moment, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate crawl. He handed the paper to Eleanor. She read it, and a warm, genuine smile spread across her face. She turned to Clara. "Miss Mayhew," she began, her voice formal but kind. "Mr. Thorne has spent the last 30 years protecting his legacy from the Bryce Callaways of the world. He has built a foundation, the Thorne Guild, dedicated to preserving and funding the very arts and crafts this country has forgotten. Woodworking, masonry, bookbinding, all of it. It is an organization with a multi-billion-dollar endowment, but it has no heart, no voice." Eleanor paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Mr. Thorne has just written his first executive order in 3 decades. He is creating a new position, Executive Director of the Thorne Guild, a role that requires a deep, intuitive understanding of craftsmanship, an appreciation for history, and the courage to recognize true value when the rest of the world sees only rags." She extended the paper to Clara. "He is offering you the job. The salary is substantial. It also comes with a comprehensive healthcare plan for you and your immediate family, effective immediately. He says to tell you that the world has enough curators for things that are already dead. He needs a curator for things that deserve to live." Clara stared at the paper, the words blurring through her tears. "Lily, the gene therapy, a future." It was all there, offered on a single sheet of paper by a man she had saved with a piece of forgotten history. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, looking at Silas. Silas reached out and gently took the carpenter's pencil back from the table. He offered it to her, handle first. It wasn't a question. It was a passing of a torch. She took it, her fingers closing around the worn, smooth wood. It felt solid, real. It felt like purpose. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I accept." A scattering of applause started from a corner table, then swelled into a thunderous standing ovation from every patron in the restaurant. They were not clapping for the billionaire. They were clapping for the waitress who had read the secret language of a good man's soul, and, in doing so, had reminded them all that the most valuable things in the world are never, ever for sale. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air of Boston swept through the open doors of a beautifully restored 19th-century workshop in the South End. The scent of freshly cut cherry wood and linseed oil filled the space, a perfume of creation. Clara Mayhew, dressed not in a Chanel suit, but in practical jeans and a simple cashmere sweater, walked through the workshop, her steps confident and sure. She paused to watch a young apprentice, a girl from a rough neighborhood with a raw, undeniable talent, carefully carving a ball and claw foot for a mahogany chair. The girl's scholarship, her tools and the roof over her head were all funded by the Thorne Guild. In the corner, sitting in a simple Windsor chair he had made himself, was Silas Thorne. He was quieter than ever, but his silence was different now. It was not the silence of frustration or isolation, but of peace. He watched the young artisans at work, a look of profound contentment on his face. A young woman entered the workshop, walking with a new, steady gait, a bright, healthy flush in her cheeks. It was Lily. The experimental therapy had worked wonders. She was a volunteer here now, meticulously cataloguing the Guild's collection of antique tools. "The final paperwork on the Callaway Tower came through," Lily said, handing a folder to Clara. "After Bryce's conviction, the board voted to donate the building to the Guild. They're renaming it Thorne House. It's going to be a free public museum and trade school." Clara smiled, taking the folder. The ultimate irony. Bryce's monument to soulless modernity would now become a sanctuary for timeless craftsmanship. She walked over to Silas and sat beside him. For a while they watched the artisan's work in comfortable silence. "You know," Clara said softly, "people still talk about that night at the Gilded Quill. They tell it like a fairy tale. The pauper who turned out to be a king." Silas turned to her. He had been working with a speech therapist, and while conversation was still a struggle, he could form short, meaningful phrases. He reached out and tapped the worn carpenter's pencil that was always in Clara's pocket. "Not a king," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, but perfectly clear. "A carpenter." He then looked at her, his pale blue eyes full of a warmth that was brighter than any gas lamp. "And you? Not a waitress?" He paused, searching for the right word. "A voice?" Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She put her hand on his. Together, the carpenter and his voice sat and watched the future being built, one perfect, handcrafted piece at a time, proving that true wealth isn't about what you own, but about what you create, what you preserve, and the legacy you build in the hearts of others.